Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be, welcome. I'd like to welcome you to this seminar on behalf of Eve Zucker, my co-host. I'm David Simon, the director of the Genocide Studies program at Yale. And we're delighted to have you join us for the first part of our two-part, I guess, mini symposium or mini conference called the Digital Archives of Atrocity Memory. This morning's session will feature a lecture by Christian Groh that Eve will introduce shortly. I'd like to, before we begin any further, acknowledge on behalf of Yale that Indigenous peoples and nations, including the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Chattahoochee, Golden Hill, Pocasset, Niantic, Quinnipiac, and Algonquin-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the land and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect that enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. The overview for today is that we'll hear from Christian Groh shortly. Then there will be what in Connecticut will be something of a lunch break. It'll be a dinner break for some of you in European and African time zones. And then we will continue with a panel discussion at 1:30 Eastern US time. We hope that if you're here for this, you'll be able to come back or stay for the second session as well. The topic at hand is our digital archives. And particularly of mass atrocities. We've recognized that increasingly these archives are archives of mass atrocities occupy the digital realm in ways that reflect the natural progression of technology and have also been prompted by issues like the pandemic. So participants at both this morning and this afternoon, participants will be discussing the innovations in digital archiving, as well as the consequences and notably, I think, some of the ethical issues that are involved in archiving in the digital era on sensitive and momentous and tremendously important subjects. For both sessions, this webinar format permits the audience to ask questions. In each case, what we'll have, especially this morning, we'll have a presentation from Christian Groh, which will last for a little bit more than the first half of the hour that we have. You can send your questions in using the question and answer, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Those questions will accumulate, and Eve and myself can monitor the question box, and we will, as best we can, relay questions to the speaker. There's also the option to ask questions anonymously, so please feel free to do so if that is your preference. However, if you don't, we're happy to share your name, and we'll of course share your name in asking the questions, with duly attributing the question to you. So without further ado, let me first introduce Eve Zucker. She's a fellow here at the she's on the board here at the Genocide Studies program. She's my co-instructor on a class that we're teaching this term on at Yale on digital memorialization of mass atrocities. And I will leave it to her to introduce our morning speaker.
Great. Thank you, everyone, and thank you all for coming today. I am very excited. We all are very excited about this, this sort of online conference we're having today. And I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker today, Christian Groh. Christian Groh is the head of archives at the Arolsen Archives. And the Arolsen Archives used to be the International Tracing Service until fairly recently, in fact. And this was a service that was set up right at the end of World War II, initially to help locate and help with displaced persons. And it has evolved in a number of ways over the years, from helping survivors of National Socialism to, first of all, prove that they were in fact prisoned and were victims of the regime. And more recently, it's now become a great source for families who want to learn about what happened to their relatives, and they're able to search for documents pertaining to their transport or imprisonment or other such related documents. And so without further ado, I want to invite Christian Groh to begin his talk today, which is titled Digital Archives of Atrocity, the Case of the Arolsen Archives. Thank you, Christian.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, Eve. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very excited myself, and I've been to Yale a year and a half ago, one of my last trips before Corona, before the COVID pandemic, together with two colleagues who presented. And we also have a, well, not too small, but a smaller project with the Fortune Archives, which are located at Yale University as well. Maybe there will be a chance to address this during the discussion. I hope you can see the screen. My presentation. You can all see that, Eve?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about the history of the Arolsen Archives. And as Eve just said, it has been called International Tracing Service until 2.5 years ago. It's still, the legal name is still International Tracing Service. And for several reasons, which I will touch shortly during my presentations, we are called Arolsen Archives today. Then chapter 2, so to say, the documentation in the Arolsen Archives. I will give a short overview of the documents that we hold, how we preserve them, how we used to digitize them, and so on. And then third of all, using the Arolsen Archives, what are the opportunities to use them? And very shortly at the end, I will touch privacy policies and ethical issues when it comes to presenting archives of atrocities online, which we do since 4 or 5 years now, and almost all our archives are online available. So by the end of World War II, almost 1,000 concentration camps all over Europe had been liberated, and a lot of the evidence had been destroyed by Nazis, by German SS or their helping troops. More than 30,000 forced labor camps were situated all over Europe and in Northern Africa. And among those 30,000, there were 2,400 special forced labor camps, especially for Jewish people. And all over Europe and Northern Africa, of course, there were a number of survivors of Nazi persecution, millions of survivors that had overcome all the atrocities, but also, let's not forget, the millions of people that had perished in the camps or elsewhere. I will not touch upon forced labor because we're talking about genocide here, but I have to remind you that actually most of our material in Arolsen Archives refers to forced laborers as well. And then of course there's an interconnection. A lot of forced laborers became prisoners of concentration camps later on. The map that is shown here is an overview that has actually been drawn by ITS staff with camps and sub-camps of the concentration camps. So even in Europe or even in Germany, I mean, you know the big names. Everyone knows Auschwitz, and Auschwitz has become the symbol of the Holocaust, of the Shoah. But of course, as I said, there's been 1,000 of camps and sub-camps all over Europe. And some of you might also know Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and so on. But if you look at the small points, tiny points here in Europe, you see the extent of genocide during World War II. And if you look at the sheer number of camps. So it's still an unknown number, but and it's still discussed in research, but we talk about roughly 10 million displaced persons in Europe, DPs, displaced persons, meaning forced laborers who were liberated, they didn't have to work for German authorities or German farms or factories anymore. They were liberated, but they were living somewhere in Germany and had to find their way back to where they came from. DPs were also those liberated from concentration camps who still lived in those camps, especially true for the camp of Bergen-Belsen, which became a DP camp after the war. So some of them were still forced to live at the same place where they had to suffer before. And some of them also lived in other camps outside of the former concentration camps. And a few of the DPs were so-called free living DPs, who were living in small flats or apartments or rooms in the often destroyed cities of Germany. First of all, the DPs were cared for by the Allies, by Allied forces, then the UNRWA, United Nations Refugee Relief Association, and then later on, the International Refugee Organization, IRO. I mentioned this because it's also all of these three institutions had their influence on the history of the International Tracing Service or Arolsen Archives, respectively. More than 1,600 DP camps were established in the German Western zones, in Austria, and also in Italy. Most of the DPs, by the time of the early 1950s, I think the last one to leave Germany, as far as we can prove it, left in 1954. Most of the DPs got repatriated to their home countries. A lot of them, of course, emigrated to what was then Palestine or the United States, Canada, Australia, and also to Southern America or the UK. And also a few of the liberated displaced persons remained in Germany, but most of them who had suffered in concentration camps, of course, did not. Most of them were actually willing to emigrate. They were cared for, as I said, by UNRWA and IRO, and one of the picture you see here is a female UNRWA officer who is interviewing a DP as a survivor of one of those camps. These DPs needed, of course, first of all, medical treatment, nourishment, a safe room, safe home again, but also a lot of them were eager to know what had happened to their missing families back home or to friends and others. Initiatives to get this information had started in 1943 by the Allied who were searching for missing people. After liberation, there were different tracing offices in the 4 occupation zones of Germany. So there were local initiatives to search. They were searched by the Allied militaries as well, but also by different organizations who had been founded long before World War II, actually, among them the American Jewish Joint, the Red Cross societies. And also there were initiatives of survivors of camps, especially the International Information Office in the concentration camp of Dachau. What you see here is one of the early tracing offices. Obviously, it's a photograph for the press, for the media. It's not a real work situation if you look at it. Very briefly, the institutional history of the Arolsen Archives. All these local initiatives were centralized into a central tracing bureau in the summer of 1945 after liberation. That was done under the head of the Allies, and coordinated search activities then under the umbrella of the United Nations Refugee Relief Association. Sorry. The first central location was in Frankfurt am Main in a small sub-village of Frankfurt called Höchst. This is a picture, we see it, and it was then in January 1946 it was relocated to the small town of Arolsen, which is in the state of Hesse. And a lot of people who visit us or who know a bit about the geography of Germany ask why in Arolsen, why in such a small town? The answer is that it's located centrally within Germany, within the smaller Germany after the war. It's very close to 3 of the 4 occupation zones. It's right between, it's on the borders between the US American and the British zone, and the Soviet zone wasn't too far away. The Soviets then drew back from the organization of the International Tracing Service, but back then it was very important to have a central location. And the other reason for that is that the big towns like Frankfurt, for example, where the offices were before, had been very badly destroyed by war and by the air war. But Arolsen, as a small town, had never suffered any war, and yeah, no damages by the war. So from January 1st, 1948, the offices were centralized to Arolsen, and by then it was called International Tracing Service, and all the search activities were centralized. This, by the way, was the first time the documentation from those several offices were sent to Arolsen as more or less the start of the archives, if you look at it this way. Very briefly, the first 3 years from 48 to 1951, the International Refugee Organization ran the International Tracing Service. Then from 1951 to 1954, it was handed over to the Lecoq. And from 1955 until recently to 2012, there was an international commission of first 9 countries, and then from the 1990s on, 11 countries who run the whole institution. And there was a director from the International Committee of the Red Cross from Geneva. So the International Commission, which is still there today, had always been there since 1955. But of course, there had to be a director on place in Arolsen. And in former times, until 2012, the International Commission of the Red Cross just sent one by their choice. And since 2012, the ICRC, for various reasons, drew back from the government of the ITS. And since then, the International Commission chose a directors. By now, it's not too long, since 2012, we had 2 directors, both of them female. The first one, US American, Rebecca Böding, who is now with the USHMM, and today it's Fran Assoulay, a French person who is specialist on human rights. In 2019, I mentioned this briefly, we were rebranded into Arolsen Archives. The legal name is still International Tracing Service, but by rebranding us into Arolsen Archives, we wanted to point out the new functions we have. We still do tracing. We still give a lot of information to people who are looking for loved ones, even 70, 80 years onwards. But we've also become an archive. We have to take care of the documentation. We want our archives, our documents, to be used, to be read. And so this one was one of the reasons why we picked the name Arolsen Archives in 2019. So some words about what is the evidence in Arolsen Archives. All in all, we have 14 miles. I don't know what it's like in the United States, but in Germany or in Europe, we count documentation in archives by kilometers or then by miles. If you put it into boxes and put it side by side, you get 14 miles of documents on Nazi persecution, on concentration camps, on Gestapo prisons, on forced labor, on the survivors, and also on the tracing requests. In our exhibition, which you see of which you see a picture here, we also put it differently, not into miles, but into high buildings or mountains. The different levels you see here are, for example, the Burj Khalifa, the largest building of the world today, the Eiffel Tower in Paris, and the Mont Blanc. And the Mont Blanc, for example, the highest mountain in Europe, if you file all the tracing requests that were sent to Arolsen, and also the replies we gave, if you pile the paper, you would get a mountain from the size as the Mont Blanc as well, just to give it an example of the extent of the documentation we have. Having said that, even though this is very impressive, and you see some of the stacks here in this picture, it's very impressive, and it's probably, or it's very likely, the largest collection on perspectives of Nazi persecution. If you compare it to Yad Vashem, or also the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., they are concentrated on the Holocaust, on the Shoah, but Arolsen also concentrates on other victims of concentration camps and on forced labors. So if you talk about Nazi persecution, we think we are the world's largest collection on all perspectives of Nazi persecution. Having said that, we have to remain aware of all the gaps, of all the information that is missing. Of course, as I mentioned, a lot of the evidence from concentration camps was destroyed before liberation by the administration of the camps, by the SS, by police forces and German military. What has survived is most of the evidence from Dachau, Buchenwald, and Mauthausen has survived this, and all of that has been handed over to us. So it's now located in the archives in Arolsen. But this is one of the gaps we have to keep in mind. And also the so-called Holocaust by bullets. So if someone wasn't deported to a camp and his or her name was put on a list, on a transport list, or maybe we have a prisoner's card from a concentration camp, if that didn't happen, and you know that a lot of people, especially in the Baltic countries, were forced into lorries and driven by the sides of the wood and were shot there, buried there. Of those, hardly any trace remains, not even in Arolsen. So this is something I always say when we go through the archives, and everyone is impressed by the sheer amount of documents we have. And this is just part of it, because some of the documents also remain in other archives, in other institutions. We have to keep in mind that this is just a small picture of the whole perspective of the atrocities back then. The archives, the Arolsen Archives documents, the original documents that we hold are since 2013 a part of UNESCO Memory of the World, which is a nice title and which is very, very good to have, but it's not connected to any special funds we get or something. It's a good argument politically, but we don't get anything from that. Today, and this has been a long issue in the history of the ITS, or of Arolsen Archives, today we are dedicated to the principle of open access. So we make most of our material available, also online available, without any registration. Maybe you can touch upon this in the discussion, especially if it comes to genocides or atrocities that have happened after 1945. So if not a long time has been spent since it happened. The creation of the collection, how did this all come together? And you see in these three pictures, you see on the very left, one of those, it's still the same building today. So the building at the back is still today, but today it's not the archives anymore, but it's just offices. I see my office myself here. And you see on the left picture, you see documents coming in from the tracing offices that I mentioned, and they were centralized into Arolsen, and they came in these wooden boxes in the late 1940s, early 1950s. In the middle, the picture shows registration cards from several concentration camps. I don't know whether you can see it, but you see the name Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mauthausen. So Here you see a storage room with documents from the original documents from the from these 3 concentration camps. This is not the way you, myself as an archivist wants to see an archive, but you see people who worked with the original documents in the large room. Of course, today this is different, but it also shows us that a lot of the documents we hold today show traces of usage because it has been used over decades and it was handed down from one office to the other. People leaned on it, maybe people drank tea or coffee along with it. So sometimes we find traces on those documents which we don't like to find as archivists. On the very right, also you see a later picture from the 1960s, again, with names of concentration camps, Mauthausen, Dachau, Flossenbürg, and so on, which shows you the way the archives was organized. So it was organized by, not by provenance as we are used to and as archivists and maybe also as historians, but by pertinence, so by topics and issues. So if someone, everything that referred to the concentration camp of Dachau was put together into one collection. This is something you have to keep in mind if you want to use it for research. As one of the questions that was asked by our hosts was how would archivists best collect, assess, and preserve material? It has always been one of the missions of the ITS, of Arolsen Archives, was to document and collect evidence. What was lacking for a long time was a clear policy and guidelines. Of course, this also changed over the years. As Eve also mentioned in her introduction, we were not only giving information to survivors or to families who were looking for loved ones, but also to as evidence in law courts and so on. So whatever we had to find to give evidence in law courts, we copied in other archives and other institutions. So today, we sometimes wish we would have had more policies and more guidelines, which I think is even more important with digital material, because we're used to work with paper and you can rearrange it and reorganize it. But I think this is very hard if you consider digital material. I go through the evidence we have, most of that. First of all, the global finding aids. It's only a finding aid for us, so it shows it's a key to the archives. But 50 million reference cards called the Central Name Index are today part of the UNESCO Memory of the World, as they are a very impressive evidence of the amount and of the size of our archives, and also of the atrocities that lay behind that. All those 50 million cards refer to more than 17 million persons. And of course, today they're electronic references, but back then they're made of paper and very small papers. And you see an example here on the very right, and it refers to Armin Hermann Adler, a Jew who came from Romania, survived several ghettos and also the concentration camp of Auschwitz, was liberated, and in January '65 emigrated to Israel with a boat. It says midship. So this is just a very small card, and it gives a reference to the archive. It's the right number on the right-hand top. It's a reference to somewhere else. I get back to this card because not all of these cards give such evidence. Sometimes you just get the name and the date of birth and maybe some reference to the archives, and you cannot really make something out of it. So this is why we have not published those 50 million cards yet. Also, another reason being the sheer size of that to put it online. The second big part of our archives refers to incarceration and persecution. So the evidence that I mentioned from the several concentration camps we found there, it contains more than 12 million documents, original documents, but also copies, microfilms, scans, and so on. This is also something that gives a headache to archivists like myself, that original material documentation that has been put together by various sources somewhere else in copies or microfilms has been put together into one collection. Sometimes we cannot even differentiate unless we look at the paper and see what is an original and what is a copy or Xerox or anything else. This is original documentation from concentration camps by German authorities of the Nazi state, for example, transport lists and so on. This example is by David Eiger, who was born in Radom and was a prisoner in concentration camp of Dachau. And not on this document, but usually not only the Lager commandant, so the commander of the camp, but also the prisoner had to sign these documents. And sometimes a signature by a prisoner can be the very last trace we have. And this is, it looks very, it's very administrative, it's very neutral, not very emotional, but it can be very emotional for families if they see the handwriting of their loved ones. And sometimes it's the only handwriting they have because there are no letters or anything left by them. We also talked about a lot of documents of survivors. So we have more than 7 million documents on displaced persons, registrations of them, also evidence of emigration when they were supported by the IRO or the UNRWA in emigrating to different countries. The documentation would be found in Arolsen as well. And David Eiger from Radom, we just heard he was liberated, and we see his registration record here, giving all the, also part of this, of his, the path of persecution at the lower level of the card. It says concentration camp Dachau. But it also gives his desired destination. If you look at in the middle of the document, it says the desired destination among the small number 12. And he wanted to emigrate to Haifa in Palestine. And here you also see the information of his parents, his father and mother. We find David Eiger on this document as well. This is a list that has been put together by German authorities, local authorities. The Allied governments made German authorities make lists of non-Germans living in their cities, and then differentiated by nationality. So David Eiger here, as the third one on this list, appears in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, a small town in Bavaria, among the Polish people living in the city. And this can be survivors of concentration camps. They can also be displaced persons as forced laborers. But they could also have been travelers who by accident were found in the city after 1945. Very briefly, we have also documents on the so-called death marches, but they're not really name related. That was one of the early initiatives of the International Tracing Service to actually exhume bodies that were from the evacuation marches from concentration camps, who just dropped dead or by hunger, or were also shot by their guards on the way, and then just buried somewhere in the cities. And it was a small research initiative in the late 1940s by ITS. And it gives some photographs, some maps of unknown dead from those death marches. Then, of course, also we hold documents about our own history, more than 14 million documents. This is still constantly growing because the tracing and documentation requests. So if someone asks for a person, we open a file and we put everything we do, the research we do, but also the evidence, the information we give is put together into one file. And we still do that today. Today in digital form. Until 3 years ago, we did this in paper, and then it was put on a scanner and digitized. And this is why this collection is still growing and growing. And you see the tracing requests for Armin Adler, we had this small card at the very beginning in the central name index. This collection also shows the ways the ITS or Arolsen Archives has handled requests. And this is very important for the institutional history, but also for the history of how German or actually European society handled dealing with the past. It mirrors social, political, and cultural changes. People today, of course, not most of the groups of people who had who were imprisoned in concentration camps are liable to get recompensation by the German state, but not all of them, for example. This is also mirrored in our own documentation, whether a group of people has recompensation claims or not, because most of the evidence for the recompensation organizations was evidenced by the ITS or by Arolsen Archives. Some words about using the Arolsen Archives, and now we get to the digital archives. Of course, we don't have a lot of digital bonds, or not yet, just until 3 years ago. But we are a digital archive because most of the paper material has been digitized. The ITS started digitizing very early, namely in the late 1990s. This is a blessing, first of all, because of course the digital material that we have is the basis for online and remote access that we offer today. But it's also a challenge to digital preservation, because of course you may imagine that scans made in the 1990s or the early 2000s don't cover any standards that we have today. So the early scans are in black and white, they're in low resolution, they don't have the right size, format, and so on. And it's also a challenge to approaches that want to use artificial intelligence, that we consider today. If we want to index further information or interpret information by artificial intelligence methodology, the early scans are not really usable for that. So this is also something I would suggest if you put together a digital archive from scratch. That what we can't. You can access Arolsen Archives documentation in the reading rooms in Arolsen, of course, but also in 7 copy holding institutions. The 11 countries that are part of the International Commission of the ITS have a right to have digital copies of our holdings in their countries, and there's 7 making use of that. And I won't mention all of them, but in Washington, DC, at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, you can actually see the same digital material that you can in Arolsen. So you can do that. And following Corona, the COVID pandemic, we also offer remote access. So if you have a research project, you can ask us for remote access. And for a certain period of time doing a project, we offer that. You can basically consult our archives from your own home. And as mentioned, we offer most of the evidence that we have online in our portal. What's the difference between the paper material and the digital archives? Of course, I prefer this picture when people use the digital material to that one when people still touch the paper. So from the archivist point of view, or from the preserving perspective, of course, online usage or digital usage is preferred. It helps us preserving the paper material. And also, if other institutions here build a digital archive, I think the accessibility but also restriction of access, which sometimes is necessary for legal reasons or also for ethical reasons, access can be controlled very easier with digital material, I think, than with paper. because with paper, either you give the paper to someone or you don't. And with digital material, you can also put up, you can set up timelines when something might become available and so on. What will be important here as well as by collecting is a clear policy and to define technical ways how to open up or how to restrict documentation to groups of people. This is just the screenshot of our online archives, where you can search by name, or you can also go through the archival trees or our classification. It was one of the questions that was asked by David and Eve, and we will hopefully touch upon them in the discussion later on. And we can see there that there are different levels of popularity using the online archives. We don't have our own instruments, but we use Google Analytics and so on. So we can see that most of the users of our online archive use the search field, and they do not use the classification of the archives. This is probably due to the fact that most of them still look for people that they know from the family, and maybe less researchers are contacting our archives. In my view, it is the responsibility as archivists and curators to highlight the gaps that I mentioned, but also to highlight material that is not popular yet, but that can become very relevant to researchers or to the public discourse and so on. We have ways to contact us on this forum. So we use the platform of Discuss that is connected to our online archives. So people can send us comments on documents. We moderate them because we didn't want anybody to misuse the documents. I have to say, but I can come back to that maybe during the Q&A. There hasn't been any misuse in 4 years now. What is coming in as comments is corrections of name spellings, of dates of birth, places of birth, and so on. And this is also something that our hosts covered as a question. Do we have the responsibility to change information? But I would say yes. But then again, how do we prove that the correction that is sent to us is right or is correct? This leads to another question that David and Eve have asked, the question of ownership of the information and the material. Looking at the time, I'm almost finished. I do that very briefly. I think the documentation, of course, the paper material is in the ownership of the ITS, of the Arolsen Archives, because it has been handed down to us. And if it wasn't for us, it would be in any state archive. And so it's owned by our institutions. But of course, the information given belongs to the public, not only to the families, but also to the public. And we have a small collection of so-called effects, so material that was taken from the prisoners and was taken from them, being kept in the concentration camps, and then somehow over years was handed down to us. And you see an example here with a photograph and some jewelry, and we consider this material as ownership of the families, or if they're still alive of the survivors, and we return this in a large campaign called Stolen Memory that they cannot, for reason of time, I cannot touch here. But all the paper material, of course, is owned by us. Digitization and access, just a few words upon that. As I said, we digitized very early from the late 1990s. We do index the material because most of the people, as I said, are looking for a name and they want to get to the document that pertains to this document, to this person. We do index our documents by own staff. We have 20 or 30 indexes. We're just doing that. Also by external service providers. We had, for example, one cooperation with Ancestry, who you might be aware of. And since COVID-19, also by the crowd, so we use a crowdsourcing platform called Zooniverse, where people can give us information on the documents, on our own documents, and this has been very successful. Again, and one last time for that, I think here again, you need clear policies and guidelines, what kind of information you want to have indexed, which standards to use, especially for geographical information and so on. And I come back to the early example of the central name card of Armin Adler we have seen before. We have indexed his name, his date of birth, and his place of birth. And also, but this is not true for all the 50 million cards, but also sometimes the path of persecution that you can see here. So he was in Ghetto Bechtorosch, he was transferred to KZ Auschwitz, and so on. But today, I wished we had done this for all the cards, but we have not. And what you see here, the circle there, we have not indexed is information who was asking for Armin Adler. And in this case, this is just, it's a German administration because he claimed recompensation, but also sometimes you find in this field here, you find people, lawyers who represented the families, or you find survivors themselves. And today it would be very interesting to know who was asking ITS or Arolsen Archives for information. So this is something that we would have to index today. Very last chapter on privacy policies and issues, and that might be different for conflicts, wars, and atrocities that have come after 1945. Being an international institution, we are not subject to any national archival or to national laws on personal data protection. But the International Commission has given us a very liberal rule that every document that is older than 25 years can be used. We are also profiting from an exception rule to the European GDPR, so the General Data Protection Rules, that have an exception for documents related to the Holocaust. So it's a bit easier here to be user-friendly than maybe for other archives. Yet, we do have ethical considerations and policies towards the people that are in our archives. For example, as I mentioned Dachau several times, we don't have a lot of photographs of prisoners. This is also often asked, do you have a picture of this or that person? And we don't have very often, but we have photographs of people who committed suicide, prisoners who committed suicide in the camps. And after a long internal discussion, we decided not to publish those online. First of all, to respect their privacy, but also because on the back of the card you can see the name of the prisoner. So you did not only see the gruesome pictures of the ways they committed suicide, but you could also tell who that was. And this is something we find it's not ethical, it's not responsible to show. So this was, small run through the institution of our, through the history of our institution, and through the ways we came from a very old, well, comparably old paper archive to digital archive that we are today. If you want to contact us, you would have to use, if you want to contact me, you have to use my private email, because I'm not with Arolsen anymore from Monday on, but of course you can contact our website and the several emails that I mentioned there. So unfortunately, I couldn't see you during the presentation, but I thank you for your patience and for listening to me. And I'm very eager to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. That was a really fascinating talk and a journey through history there. I know there's questions. I just want to ask one though myself before we get started here. And I know we don't have much time, so I'll just ask one brief question. And you talked quite a bit, and we actually talked a little bit about this before the session started, about the difference in handling and working with physical documents. And in the pictures that you were showing, it was a particular type of work and physical, interaction with other archivists and with the archives themselves. And it's a different sort of way, in some ways, of looking for particular documents than it is using a computer screen. And so I was wondering a little bit, would you say that there's been a fundamental change of some sort in the way of what the archive is? Is it something a little bit different in its digital state than it is in its physical manifestation? And also, is the way that we learn, the way that we know from that archive, has that also shifted as we move to the digital?
Well, it definitely changed. I think it changed the ways archives are looked at. I think digitization and digital archives help us to be more open. I mean, the 7 copy holding institutions, you don't have to travel to Germany anymore to look at the evidence. You can see it online on a screen, and you can do your research. You can find family members and so on, which is very important. We get responses from family members that tell us it's great that you have this information online, and we're very glad that it's here, and so on. So this is a chance. What I think what is different is, but it's less an issue than I had thought, is I mean, I can misuse the digital material. I grew up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and grew up with paper. And how can I be sure that the evidence that we show online is the same as we hold it in our archives? I mean, there's no real way to prove that. And I mean, if you're a good IT guy, which I'm not, you can manipulate digital documents. And this is something I think we have to learn and be aware of, how to make sure that this is really authentic. And maybe as very short answer, anecdotes of that, what I thought would be more important is that people want to see and touch the paper. It is very important for people who visit us in Arolsen, or who used to visit us before the COVID pandemic. It can be very emotional. As I showed this prisoner's registration, and if you show this to a son, daughter, or great son or great daughter, granddaughter of someone who perished in a camp, and you show them this is the signature by your relative, it's very emotional, and I'm not sure whether it's the same if they see it on the screen. So the haptic, touching the document, or seeing it and seeing this 80 years ago was signed by my relative is something that might be missing if you look at a digital archive. But it's actually, I've been there for 7 years now, and only twice people asked to have the paper. I mean, researchers are happy to look at the digital archive, and this might be something that has changed over the years and will change again.
Right, that's really interesting. I find it surprising that only 2 people asked for the physical document, and I wonder if that's going to actually end up changing over time as people start to question what they're looking at online more and more on the one hand, and also wanting to have that tangible experience. But anyway, so we have a quick question from William Kwok, who's actually a PhD candidate here at Yale. And so we'll ask that quickly, and then David has a question and as well. So first, William's question is, you mentioned indexing and AI. Are the more recently scanned documents OCR'd?
No, we have done some experience with them. The problems we have with OCR is that, first of all, not only the scans are bad, but also the original paper is very bad quality. As I mentioned, they have stains, there are holes on them, and so on. And if you have like registration forms or formatted documents, they're not typed, but most of the time people wrote on them with their handwriting. And so the handwriting is very hard to be OCR'd. And then also they cross lines within the form documents. So this is where OCR really has problems. But we're in contact with service providers of that. We're looking at the progress this has made, but most of the material we have is not suitable for OCR.
Okay, great. Thank you. David?
Yes, thank you very much, Christian. That was wide-ranging and fascinating. I wanted to ask a question that was somewhat on behalf of and certainly inspired by a question asked in the chat from Antonella Giordano, who refers to a project in a small town in Argentina. It led me, or her question, which was about connecting with you essentially, it led me to the broader question of how Arolsen Archives might be used for education purposes. Is there a sort of standardized way to build curricula based on the material that is in your archives, or are there also standard ways in which students might gain experience dealing with archival materials and archival research that take place with your archives?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't touch on this in my presentation, but there's I'm head of archives, but also there's a department called Research and Education, and they have a lot of programs and agendas. Most of that actually you can find online on our website as well. For example, there's curricula for, well, then European or mostly German students from high schools or similar, who are traveling to the sites of concentration camps, to the memorial sites, and they find ways how to search in our archives, how to search for people in their respective hometowns who perished in this certain camp. So this is one example of an educational program that we put on. And with our crowdsourcing initiative that is called Every Name Counts, where also a lot of students were indexing material. I know that the colleagues are developing educational programs as well. So, but that would be a topic for another talk of at least half an hour or an hour maybe. And when we visited Yale a year ago, my colleague was with me, and he's developing all the educational material. So I think he appreciated to be invited again.
Well, I will just add that that's one of the exciting elements of the digitization of archives, is that and the digital era, that we can have, first of all, have this global conversation, and that you in Germany, us in New Haven, perhaps a teacher in Argentina can be part of this conversation in a way that was obviously unimaginable 20 years ago. I proposed that we've hit our noon sort of witching hour here, but questions are starting to come a little bit more. Christian, do you mind if we continue on for another 5 or 6 minutes?
I'm fine with that. Sure. Okay.
Great. Thank you. Eve, do you want to go to the questions then? And
yeah, I don't, just so you all know, I don't see the full, and longer last names, I'm not seeing the full last name on the screen, so I'm just going to read off people's first names. So this question comes from Victor, who says, you have an extraordinary amount of documents. At present, what percentage of these are in an online searchable format? And what is your preferred format or formats for searchable documents? Thank you.
Yeah, well, a question I was afraid of. We said that 85% of the documents that we have are digitized. And of those 85%, I think 90% are online. But then again, they're online, but not all of them are searchable. So we have made the decision that we put everything that is scanned and that for legal or ethical reason can be put online is online, even though if it's not indexed yet. So even if it's not searchable yet. So I cannot put it into percentages or numbers, what is searchable. You just have to keep in mind that we're constantly indexing and cataloging more material, so that the ways to find information are improving almost on a daily basis. Really, we get a lot of index information from those crowdsourcing initiatives. Of course, we have to assess that, and then it takes some time before it's online. But if you look for people, or even if you look for a topic today and you don't find anything, it's always worthwhile to come back in, say, 1 or 2 months' time and to try again. But I couldn't put it into numbers, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I think maybe we have time for 2 more questions. So the first one's from Chiman. Hi, I'm Chiman from Cambodia. I'm excited to join this digital webinar. I have 2 questions. Why was the organization rebranded into the Arolsen Archives, and what and how will the archives benefit the world? That's from one person, and I have one more after that. Would you, actually, maybe I'll ask all of them at the same time, and then you can, but just for the sake of time here. The second question is from an anonymous attendee. Do you have any challenges with victims' families who don't want to show their victim, who don't want their family member who is a victim to be shown, their image or their documents to be available online? And if you do have this, if this issue comes up, then what do you do about it? Also on that, it was whether anything has changed since it's become part of the memory of the world, joined that enterprise, and are there guidelines then coming from UNESCO on this?
Okay, I hope I remember everything. The rebrand into Arolsen Archives was that, first of all, International Tracing Service, a lot of time was misunderstood, and especially the abbreviation ITS, which exists several times, and there's also an international travel service, for example, and we were often there were some misunderstandings that we offered travel offices or something. So we wanted to have a new name that expresses what we do in a better way. And then as tracing is still part of our work, but it's not, I mean, it's not central anymore. We don't go out there and find new evidence anymore. We don't trace anymore. We still give information, but it's no tracing anymore. We wanted to have a new brand, a new name. So we said, today we're an archive, we're preserving the material, we digitize it, we make it accessible. This is something every archive does. So that was one of the reasons. And it was called Arolsen, and it's, I have to admit, this has been very controversial in the discussion, and I was part of the discussion. We used Arolsen because among the survivors, or the families from survivors, especially from Israel, but also from the United States or other English-speaking countries, we were known by Arolsen. So none of them said, we have received information from the ITS or from International Tracing Services, but they said, we have received information from Arolsen. So we thought that's a telling name, Arolsen Archives, among the community. So that was one of the reasons for the rebrand. I forgot the second question from Asia, which was about, well, I can look it up.
A very big question about, you know, the good that it does in the world. If you can summarize that in a word or two.
I think, yeah. I mean, again, worldwide, there's this discrimination again, and the knowledge about the Holocaust is it's not vanishing, but it becomes less and less, even in countries where it happened, even there. I mean, a lot of people don't know a lot of what has happened. So I think our archives, and especially if we put material online and we accompany this with educational programs, can make a change today. This is, I mean, it might sound very big, full of pathos, but I think it is there and it's evidence, and it can warn you about things happening today. And yeah, another anecdote, we're also part of a European project. You might have heard of European Holocaust Research Infrastructure. That is a portal that shows all the evidence about the Holocaust in several countries and archives. And when the portal was opened 4 or 5 years ago, I don't know anymore, there was a big event, big celebration in Berlin. And what was great, that people who were critical of the approach were invited as well. And then there were older researchers, historians, archivists who said, well, it's not the same if you look at the digital online material, you have to consult the paper. And I mean, I said, I'm a bit sad that people don't ask more about the paper, but of course, not everyone has the means to travel. And if you look for students or PhD candidates and so on, no one has the means to travel to Arolsen if you come from Argentina or from Asia. And then back then in the discussion, someone, I think she was from China, stood up and she said, well, I'm very happy. I'm a fellow here in Berlin and I can visit you in Arolsen. But there's a really big interest in the Holocaust or in European history, also in Asian countries. And none of us has the chance to come to Arolsen and to consult the papers. So I think this is also a change of digital archives today. And yeah, the UNESCO, there's no guidelines how we have to treat the material today. Of course, we wouldn't have gotten the Memory of the World label, and we could lose it again if we don't take care of the preservation. But there's no clear guidelines. They don't tell us what to do, actually.
Right. Okay. Yeah, there was, I think that question was just, was concerned that people that are the victims' families have some control over the documents that are available online.
Yeah, I forgot about this one. We offer that we take information offline, so people can write to us and say we don't want to have this information online. I think in 4 years this happened 7 or 8 times. Most of the times we take it offline, and in one case we did not, because even according to the German to the strict German archival and data protection laws, that material that was asked to be put offline would have been available, so even in the strict standards, and it didn't show anything that was that touched ethical issues or anything. So we said, well, this is evidence we want online, and we keep it, and then that was fine. It's different, especially if it refers to survivors of the Holocaust, to DPs who survived and then emigrated, for example, to the United States. And if that happened in the 1950s, I mean, it could still be the same address. And if people ask us to put that offline, we just do that, and we can do that within 24 hours. And then you don't see the picture anymore, you just see the data, so the name that refers to the document. And then someone wants to see that, they have to approach us, and then we can see who is looking at it. So yeah, if someone wants that, we take it offline, but it doesn't happen very often. And also there, I think we have to keep in mind that there's different categories of groups of people who are persecuted. It's most Jewish families want this to be online, want this to be out, but we also have a lot of evidence about gypsies that in Germany today we call Sinti and Roma, and there's still a lot of discrimination against Jews even today, also in Germany, but even more so against Sinti and Roma, against gypsies. And they're much more conservative when it comes to publishing things online. So what we are not doing, even if we could do it, for example, you cannot look for all the gypsies that were deported from a small town in the middle of Germany to this and that camp. I mean, technically that would be possible, but we don't make it possible online because that might lead to misuse, even though it would be a great instrument for researchers, but then they can contact us.
Okay, well, fabulous. Listen, so I think we're out of time for this section of our program today, and so we will we'll take a pause here, and then we will meet back again at 1:30 for our afternoon program. 1:30, that is, of course, here in on the East Coast of the United States. If you're somewhere else, it would be, well, about an hour and 15 minutes from now, wherever you are. Well, thank you.
I'd like to add my thanks as well, Christian. This was really a fascinating conversation and a presentation and conversation, and I think it does an excellent job of sort of kicking off this mini conference in a very productive way. When Eve and I designed the conference, we wanted to have we were cognizant of the Zoom fatigue that is sweeping over much of the world. So that's why we added in what amounts to a meal break, a lunch break here, a dinner break there, wherever you might be. We really hope that you will stay with us, come back. This is both to Christian and everyone else who is online, that you'll come back for the second part of this, when we'll have a discussion about archives, a roundtable discussion about digital archiving with representatives from archive efforts in Bosnia, Rwanda, and Cambodia. So with that, thanks again, Christian. Also, I want to add my thanks to Hira Jaffrey. I'll thank her at the end as well, but she's running the show behind the scenes and always really does a tremendous job for us, making all of this possible here at Yale. So with those thanks, I look forward to starting up again in an hour and 15 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks.